Hi, Jakob Stief here, the long-haired freaky dude. Today I'm going to talk about Cratylus by Plato, semi-translated into English by Benjamin Jowett. I've got to say, there's not much for me to talk about here. Speaking frankly, much of this dialogue is useless when read as an English translation because simply most of it can't be translated. The nature of this discussion is on the origin of names for things and whether or not they came about simply by custom and common acceptance of things or whether they came about through some sort of deeper, diviner means. This discussion very quickly turns towards the topic of etymology, and that continues throughout most of the dialogue. Now, etymology, that is the study of the origin of words. So they take Greek words, and they try to figure out where they came from. What are the components of this word, including, but not limited to, the word tit. They find other smaller Greek words and they find other smaller Greek words and try to figure out how they make up the bigger words. This is nearly impossible to translate into English because once you translate these words into English, you can no longer pick them apart the same way as you did in Greek. You can no longer see how smaller Greek words make up larger Greek words because they're now English. So therefore, a lot of it would be pointless to translate, and a lot of it's kept in Greek. Now, I don't know Greek, so a lot of this discussion just went right over my head, you know. Though, from what I hear, Socrates is a very shabby etymologist. If I knew Greek, I'm sure this would have had a lot more meaning to me. I'm sure the dialogue would have been a lot more easier to follow along, and I'm sure that I would have got a lot more out of the discussion. Who knows, maybe when I know Greek, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years, I'll come back to this dialogue and try to actually get something out of it. The rest of the dialogue, which is a very small portion of the dialogue, is dedicated to the origin of names. So there's 3 characters, Socrates, Hermogenes, and Cratylus. Hermogenes' take on this is that names are a thing of custom, that they're commonly accepted by a group of people to be how we attribute a name to something. Cratylus, however, thinks that there are divine means at play, even going so far as to think that names are divinely inspired. Cratylus believes that a name must be perfect or else it is not a name at all. Even if someone mistakes a name by 1 letter, it is no longer the name of that person or that thing. But this argument, Cratylus' argument, goes right over the heads of a modern English reader, much as the Greek language. Back then, it was entirely possible that the gods were creators of the language and that they gave everything a name which was a perfect and true representation of that. But nowadays, to the modern reader, that simply doesn't hold true. That simply isn't a valid theory that the gods could have done this. We have witnessed languages appear out of thin air, without any divine inspiration from the gods. Take English, for instance, that just appeared within the last thousands of years. But let's talk about it briefly anyway, shall we? Cratylus says that words have no error. They do not err, and are perfect representations of the thing while somehow not being the thing itself. Here's a quote by Socrates, which I love simply because it's so true and so frustrating. If someone started out with even a very small error who created the words, then as time progressed and words made into other words, we would be filled with a whole bunch of errors because that tiny little error would be extrapolated. If he did begin an error, he may have forced the remainder into agreement with the original error and with himself. There would be nothing strange in this any more than in geometrical diagrams, which have often a slight and invisible flaw in the first part of the process, and are constantly mistaken in the long deductions which follow. If you have studied Euclid's Elements and have tried to follow along with his propositions, you know exactly what he's talking about. Another thing Socrates points out about this argument is that names are not quantitative. That is to say, it's either 9 or not 9 at all. It's not like this. Names are qualitative. It could be slightly off and we still know what it means. Anyways, Hermogenes' notion seems much more viable, even to Socrates, in that words are their best representations of the object so far in that we have created them and have come to a common consensus that they are a representation of them. Perhaps by the movements of our mouth, having a play in that representation, but it's still a common consensus. And so at the end of this dialogue, we actually have somewhat of a conclusion, which is a nice breakaway from the common trend of the rest of the dialogues, which are just open-ended and vague. Though Socrates does end it by asking if there can be absolute beauty in the world, which is a rather big question to ask, and of course, it is not answered by the end. Until next time, yeah? Now this is also the first place where I've seen a small hint of Plato's theory on forms and ideas, not just in his question of whether or not there could be absolute beauty, but also in the beginning of the dialogue where he talks about things and their composition, and how no matter what an object is made of, it is still that object. It's just a hint of his theory, but it's there, and it is exciting. Now they talk briefly about different thinkers, Anaxagoras being one of them, who apparently was the first guy to discover that the light from the moon is merely light reflected from the sun off the moon. And then there's the Orphic poets who believe that the body is a prison for the soul where it is forced to suffer punishment in the form of sin. And of course there's Protagoras who believes that man is the measure of all things. And here's a quote from Socrates which I just found incredibly ironic. I believe the primeval givers of our names were undoubtedly like too many of our modern philosophers, who, in their search after the nature of things, are always getting dizzy, from constantly going round, and then they imagine that the world is going round and moving in all directions. This is ironic on two levels. A, because Socrates himself often goes round and makes himself dizzy with his round notions, and B, it was later discovered, of course, that the earth does in fact go round and round. And a few more things on the nature of Socrates. At last, my friend, I found myself in a far greater perplexity about the nature of justice than I was before I began to learn. Yes, you do tend to do that, Socrates. And I have long been wondering at my own wisdom. I cannot trust myself, and I think that I ought to stop and ask myself, what am I saying? For there is nothing worse than self-deception, where the deceiver is always at him and always with you. It is quite terrible. Indeed, I do agree with that. Nothing worse than self-deception. I mean, I find my mind often betraying me, whether in my philosophy, my morals, my whatever. Often it goes astray from what I thought. You know, sometimes my gut will compel me to do something which my mind doesn't necessarily want me to do, and sometimes my mind will reason itself into going against or going for something which I would have never been for or against. Anyways, I'm Jakob Stief, the long-haired freaky dude. Thank you for watching this discussion, this pathetic discussion of Cratylus. If you want to see other discussions, better discussions of books that can actually be translated into English, I encourage you to check out my channel and hit the subscribe button. Also, check out the Great Books Challenge, where we're reading through the great books of the Western world. And also, I'll be going off to college soon, so if you could, please check out my GoFundMe and contribute $1 to it. It will be incredibly helpful. Well, I'm Jakob Stief, the long-haired freaky dude. Thank y'all for watching. See you in the next video. Have a good day.